In this Blender tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this procedural coal material. If you'd like to help support me and this channel, as well as purchase the tutorial files, then you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And I've also created another 10 procedural materials, and so I've just released Blender Procedural Material Pack number 7. So as many of you know, I do create a lot of procedural material tutorials, and so every time I create 10 more procedural materials, I compile them together into a procedural material pack. So if you'd like to check out my procedural material packs, I'll have the links in the description where you can purchase on my Gumroad store. And purchasing the material packs is a really great way to help support me and this channel so I can continue to create more tutorials. And if you'd like to learn how to create more procedural materials, then I'll also have a link in the description to my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist where you can learn how to create all of my procedural materials. Now, to make the coal lumpy and bumpy, I am going to be using the displacements in the node editor. And so because of that, I will be using the cycles render engine in this tutorial. Because in Blender Eevee, the node editor displacements will not work. Now, if you don't want to use the displacements, you totally don't have to. And if you would rather use Blender Eevee for this tutorial, then I will show you how to create some basic chunky coal objects. And then we will be creating a separate variation of this coal material without the displacement, and it'll work better for Blender Eevee. Here is the material in Blender Eevee, so it does work pretty well in Eevee, but you can see that the node editor displacements don't work, and so this mesh here isn't bumpy at all, it's very smooth. So if you don't want to use the displacements, or if you want to use Blender Eevee, you can totally do that, and I will show you how to create these little coal objects. So in the 3D space, I just pressed Shift A, and then I went right down here and I added an icosphere. And then when you add the icosphere, right behind me, if you click on the little add icosphere settings, you can turn up these subdivisions, and I just turned it up to like a 6. And I did want to turn it up pretty high so that it's nice and smooth, but I also want to turn this up pretty high so that it has more detail for the displacements. And I will also be setting up the adaptive displacement in this tutorial so that where it's rendering from, it'll be a little bit higher detail, but then it will be lower detail where it's farther away. And then I also just shaded this object smooth. And then for the lighting, I just added a circle right here, and I just pointed the circle at the object. And then I also just gave it an emission material with a strength of 50, and that way we get some nice bright lighting on our sphere here. And if you're using Blender Eevee, then the emission material won't actually be emitting light. It'll just look like it's bright, but it won't actually be emitting light. So if you're using Blender Eevee, you can just press Shift A, and you could just like go down here to light and just add a normal sunlight. And then I'm just gonna like rotate the sunlight over, just point it over there. And then right over here on this side panel, you can go to the object data properties of the light, and you could just turn the strength up. Maybe I'll just turn mine up to like a 10. If you're using Blender Eevee, you could use that light instead. And then to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, I added in this Abandoned Hull 01 1K HDR, and this is from polyhaven.com, so the link's in the video description if you'd like to download the same HDR that I'm using. So right here in the world nodes, what you can do is you can just add a new world, and then click right here on this yellow dot here next to the color, and you can change this to environment texture, and then you can just click on open and open up the HDRI. And then for those other chunky coal pieces, let me show you how I created those. So I actually used a Blender add-on, and it's built into Blender, so you just need to enable it. So to enable the add-on, you can click right here on edit and then open up the preferences. And then in Blender's user preferences, you can just click over on the add-ons tab, and on the search here, you can search for extra, and then right here, you can just check mark the add mesh extra objects add-on. And when we add this in, there's going to be a rock generator that will generate rocks for us. And also I will be using the Node Wrangler add-on in this tutorial when we're setting up the procedural node. So while we're in the user preferences, you can just search for node right up here on the search, and just make sure you turn on the Node Wrangler add-on. And then you can just close the user preferences. All right, so now that the add mesh extra objects add-on is turned on, I can press Shift A, and if you go right here to search, you can see that there are a bunch of new objects here. And so I'm going to click on this one right here, which is the rock generator. And then this is going to generate rocks for us. Now don't move the rock around or anything. Right after you add add the rock, you can click on this add rocks right here. So click on the add rocks and that is going to open up this tab, and you can see that there are a bunch of different settings here to change the rocks. So you can change the X, Y, and Z scale if you want to change the scale of it. And there are a bunch of different settings here like the detail level and the display detail and the amount of smoothness. I'm just going to leave all the settings at the default, but you can definitely play around with these settings. One thing I want to do though is add more rocks. So right here it says number of rocks right up on the top here. And so I'm just going to turn this number up to 3, and that is going to generate 3 rocks. So I can now just click on this little tab here to close the add rocks, and I'll just bring myself back over. All right, so now that you've added those rocks, you can just select the rocks and you can press G to grab, and you can just move these rocks over, and you can see that it's generated rocks for us. Now, if you click right over here on the modifier properties, you can see this is what the add-on's done. So if you actually press the tab key to go into edit mode, you can see these rocks are actually pretty simple, but then the rock generator has added some subdivision surface modifiers to give it more detail, and then it's given it all these displacements to give it lots of bump. And also when you render these rocks, they will be higher detail, but you can see right here on the subsurf modifiers, the viewport is set to 2, but the render is set to 3. So when it renders, it'll actually be rendered with higher detail. If you want to preview the final detail though, how detailed it's going to be when it renders, right here on the levels viewport, you can click right here and turn that up to 3, and then that'll show how it's going to look when it's actually rendered. So I'm just going to do that by clicking on the next rock and then turning the viewport to 3 and the viewport right here to 3, and then I will click on this one, and then I can turn the viewport to 3 and the viewport to 3. And then if you want to change the shape of the rocks, you can select the rock and press tab, and that is going to go into edit mode, and you can just select some points and press G to grab, and you can just play around with the shape of those rocks if you want to change them, because that rock was a bit sharp and I didn't want it to be quite that sharp. And you can also scale the rocks and rotate them and just kind of get them into place. Now of course these look like rocks, but they will work really well for chunks of coal as well. And then I also added a camera and just stuck the camera right here looking at the objects. So I'm just going to move these rocks around and place them where I want. All right, now just one more thing I want to do before we set up the procedural material. I want to set up the displacements and the adaptive displacements on this object right here. So what I'm going to do is click right up here on the render properties. And if you want to use the displacements in the node editor, then you need to be in cycles. So just make sure right up here on the render engine that you have it set to cycles if you want to use the displacement. Now I am also going to change the feature set to experimental because I want to use the adaptive displacement. Now it's totally optional. If you don't want to use the adaptive displacement, you don't have to. And what the adaptive displacement does is it makes the object higher detail where it's closer up, but then parts of the object which are farther away from the camera are going to be less detail. I will be setting this to experimental to use the adaptive displacement. So now I need to add a material. So I'm going to select this object right here, and then I can click on new, and I'm going to rename this material to procedural coal. Now we need to tell this material to use the displacement. So what I'm going to do is click right over here on the material properties, and then I'm going to scroll down. And then right down here, you can open up this settings tab right here. And remember, if you're using Blender Eevee, then this will not work. So make sure you are using cycles. So then on the displacement right here, it's set to bump only. I want to change it to displacement and bump. And that way we're telling the material to use the displacement. And then if you want to set up the adaptive displacement, you can. So to set up the adaptive displacement, I'm going to click right here on the modifier properties. And then I'm going to click on add modifier, and I'm going to go right down here and add a subdivision surface modifier on this sphere object. And then because we turned the feature set to experimental, you can see that there is this adaptive subdivision. So you can just check mark that. And then I will just set the dicing scale to 5. That works pretty well for my object. And then I'm going to hold down the Z button and move up into the rendered view and let go to preview that in the rendered view. All right, so let's finally set up the procedural material now. So I'm going to start by pressing Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. We're just going to drop the Voronoi right down here. Now I also want to use the object coordinates. So with this Voronoi texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl T, and that is using the feature from the Node Wrangler add-on. We turned on the Node Wrangler at the starting of this video. And so this is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. Now I don't actually need the mapping node because the mapping node is just going to change the location of the texture, but I don't need to do that. So I'm going to click on the mapping and I'll press X to delete it. And then I want to use the object coordinates so I can plug the object into the vector. And then also using the main feature of the Node Wrangler add-on, if you hold down the Control and Shift key, you can then select different nodes, and that is going to add this viewer node right here, and it'll allow you to preview what the node's looking like. Now I actually want to hold down the Control and Shift key and then select it again, and this one is going to go to the color so we can preview the color from the Voronoi. Now if I zoom in here, you can see that those edges are very sharp, and I want them to be more smooth. So I'm going to click on the F1, and I'm instead going to change it to Smooth F1. So Smooth F1 is pretty much exactly the same, but we have this smoothness value right here. So I can now just change the smoothness value, and you can see it's going to be kind of more blurred. So on this smoothness value, I'm going to change this to a 0.34, just so that it's a little bit blurred. And then I'm also going to turn this scale value down to like a 2. Now I want to put this into the normal to give it some bump, and then I will also be adding this into the displacement. So the first thing we can do is take the color, and we're going to put the color into the normal to give it some fake bump, but then I need to convert this to normal data because this is color data. You can see it's yellow, but then this right here, this is normal data and it's purple. So I need a node in here to convert this data to normal data. So I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go to the search here, and I can search for the bump node, and let's drop the bump node right down here. So the color is actually going to go into the height on the bump, and then the normal can go into the normal. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled BSDF, and you can see now it looks kind of bumpy. Now it's kind of hard to see because it is so white. So on the base color here on the principled, I can just turn this way down to like a dark color, or you can make it fully black, and you can now see those bumps in there. Now that is a little bit strong, and I do want to make it a bit less strong. So on the strength value right here, I'm going to turn this down to like a 0.4, so it's not quite as strong. Now you can see that this isn't actually displacing the mesh. That's because this is just the normal, but we are going to be adding this value into the displacement as well to make it actually pop out the mesh. Now I also want to give this material a lot more detail, so I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's drop the noise texture right down here underneath the Voronoi. And I can just bring the Voronoi up a little bit. And then I want to use the object coordinates as well on the noise texture, so I'm going to plug the object into the vector. And so the object coordinates are going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And then I can also hold down the Control and Shift key and select the noise texture, and that is going to preview it. And then on the scale here, on the noise texture, I'm going to change this down to like a 2, but then I do want to give it lots of detail. So I'm going to drag the detail level all the way to the max, which is 15. So I now want to plug this noise texture into the bump as well. So I'm going to click on this bump node, kind of bring it over, and then I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it right in here. So the normal is going to go through the normal, and then that's going to go into the principled. So we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So I'm going to take the factor from the noise texture, and I'm going to plug that into the height right here. So I can Control Shift and select this bump. You can see that's what it looks like, but then we're adding two bump maps together. So I can Control Shift and select this bump, and you can see now we have all that bumpiness right there, and that's going to make it look a lot like coal. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled BSDF, and that is looking really cool. All right, now we haven't actually put anything into the base color yet, so let's do that. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A, and I'm going to search for a mix RGB. Let's drop the mix RGB right here, because what I want to do is I want to take this texture, and I want to mix them together, and then we can put that into the base color. So I'm going to take the color from the Voronoi, and I'm going to put that into color 1, and then I'm going to take this factor from the noise texture, and I'm going to put that into color 2. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix RGB to preview it. Now I don't want this to be set to a mix. I want to click on this, and I instead want to change it to darken, and that way it's going to add the dark values. And then on the factor here, I want to turn this all the way up to 1. So you can see if it's turned all the way down, it's only going to be this Voronoi, but then if we turn this all the way up to 1 on the factor, it's going to add that noise there from the noise texture. Now this is still using those colors from the Voronoi, and so I just want to make this gray colors. So to convert these just to gray colors, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for a color ramp node, and let's click on the color ramp, and I'm just going to drop it right here. So the darken is going to go into the factor. So now it's converted just to black and white data, and you can see now it's pretty white, but I do want to make the coal very dark. So I'm going to click on this white tab right here, and I will click on the color, and I'm going to make it a very dark color, even a little bit darker, so just something like that. So we have this very dark coal because coal is pretty dark. So I now want to take the color right here and I want to put the color into the base color. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled BSDF. And so now we just have a little bit of variation in the colors because we're using these textures. All right, now this coal material is very shiny, and so I do want to make it more rough. So what I'm going to do is take the color right here from this Voronoi, and I'm going to put the color into the roughness right here on the principled. And then I want to have more control over this because you can see this is actually pretty shiny. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for another color ramp node. And let's just drop the color ramp node right in here between the Voronoi and the roughness. So the color is going to go into the factor, and then this color ramp color is going to go into the roughness. So if I make the values more white, then it's going to be more rough, and if the values are more dark, it's going to be more shiny. So I can click on this black tab right here, and then I can click on the color, and I can start to make it lighter and lighter. And you can see as I make it lighter, it's more rough. And so I do want to make this pretty light because coal is pretty rough. It's not very shiny. So just something like that is pretty good. All right, now even though this is a really dark color ramp, and even though this is pretty rough, you're still able to see the coal very well, and it kind of looks gray, and I want it to look much more dark. So what I'm going to do is turn the specular value down, and that way it's going to be less reflective. So on the specular value on the principled BSDF, I'm going to turn that down to like a 0.15, and that way it's much darker. You can see that is very dark. Alright, so this coal material is looking pretty cool, but I want to add those little chunky bits with the displacement. So to add the displacement, I first need to press Shift A, and I'm going to go to the search here, and I'm going to search for the displacement node, and let's drop this right down here. Because just like the normal here, this is normal data, and then this is color data. And so I need to add a value into the displacement to actually displace the mesh, but this needs to be displacement data, but then this over here, these nodes here, these are color data and factor data. So the displacement node is going to act as a converter to convert any data to displacement data. So I will bring the displacement node right here under the principled BSDF, and then I can take the displacement and plug that into the displacement on the material output. Now it's making it really small, and we don't actually have any data in the displacement right now. So what I want to do is mix these two together, kind of like we did right here. I want to mix them together, and then we can put that into the displacement, and that way these textures will displace the mesh. So what I'm going to do is click on this darken node, and then I'm going to press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D is going to duplicate the node, but it's going to keep the wires plugged up. And so I'm going to bring this duplicated mix RGB right down here, kind of underneath these bump nodes. And then I'm going to Control Shift and select the darken to preview it. And now I don't actually want it to be set to darken. I'm going to click on the darken right here, and I'm going to instead change this to add. So right here, I'm going to change this to add. And then also I want to switch these values because I actually want this Voronoi texture to be on the bottom. So what I'm going to do is take color 1, and I'm going to put that into color 2 instead. And then that way the noise texture is going to be bumped up into color 1. So the factor is going to go into color 1 on the add, and then the Voronoi color is going to go into color 2 on the add. And then on the factor, right now it's set to 1, but I actually want to change it down to like a 0.5, so it's more of an even blending in between the two nodes. Alright, so we've now mixed both of these textures together using this add here. So I now want to plug this into the displacement. So I'm going to take the color, and I'm going to plug that into the height value of the displacement, and that's going to convert it to displacement data. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled BSDF to preview it. Now that is way too strong. You can see it's really, really strong. So I'm going to turn this scale right here down to like a 0.3. And now that I've set that to a 0.3, you can see there's all these little chunky bits right there, and that is coming from the Voronoi color. But then there's also a bunch of little roughness right here and noise, and that is coming from this noise texture. And that is it. So that is the finished procedural material. Now, if you're using Blender Eevee and you don't want to use the displacements, I'm also going to be creating another variation of this material on these objects right here that won't be using the displacements. So what I can actually do is I can just click right here and drag, and I can drop this material onto these other objects. Now I don't actually want to use the displacements on this object. So what I want to do is duplicate this material and then just remove the displacement. So to duplicate this material, I can click on this icon right here. It kind of looks like two pieces of paper, and that is going to duplicate the material, but it's going to keep the same information. So you can now see that it says procedural coal.001. I'm just going to rename this to procedural coal no displacements. Now to get rid of the displacement, I'm just going to click on this add and press X to delete it, and then click on the displacement and press X to delete it. And there we go. So we now have pretty much the same material, but it just doesn't have the displacement. So now I can put this material on these other objects. So I'm going to click right here and drag and drop it right there. And then I can also click right here and drag and drop this material onto that piece of coal as well. And there we have it. So that is the procedural coal material. So I'll just give this a final render now. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you so much for watching. And again, if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, then you can purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store, and all of my patrons over on my Patreon page also get access to my procedural materials. And also I've just recently released Blender Procedural Material Pack number 7, so if you'd like to check out my Blender Procedural Material Packs, I'll have the links in the description. And if you'd like to watch more of my procedural material tutorials, then you can also check out my Blender Procedural Material playlist on YouTube. But I hope this tutorial was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.